Welcome to Three Devs and a Maybe, the podcast series for beginner web developers and general web enthusiasts. Now, introducing your show hosts, Michael Budd, Fraser Hart, Lewis Keynes, and Ed Mann.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Three Devs and a Maybe. My name's Ed Mann, and today we are very lucky to be joined by Camille Baldock. Hello, Camille. Hello again. It's almost like deja vu. It's not like we've done this 5 minutes ago at all. For the audience, so what I'll probably know actually, audience, is that I've been doing a lot of API work recently in my day job, and my API usage and kind of what I've been doing a lot throughout the years has been pretty progressive of what kind of the norm is really. You have like some trivial endpoints that you have a bit of documentation for, then you move up to the quotes RESTful stuff, and then like now what I've been able to do is start looking into things like Hypermedia APIs, and obviously any new topic, any new concept, you hit Google, you try and find out resources, and one of the good resources that I actually found online, and one of the first as well, was Camille's video from I think it was late last year. And It was a video talking about Hypermedia APIs and going through them in a really concrete, nice way. So I thought, why not try and get Camille on the podcast to maybe discuss further and talk about all these different concepts and stuff. So unfortunately, she said, she was kind enough to. So hello, Camille.
Hi, Ed. It's a pleasure to be on the show.
Again, hello. So Camille, how are things going?
Oh, really well. Just sitting at home, about to geek out about APIs. So, it's looking good.
I don't know if you know the format of the show. Typically, what we do is we kind of, we have like a main topic, which is ours going to be API, but it's kind of nice to kind of get a feel for like, the guest and how they got into programming. So I don't know if you mind like to maybe explain to the audience how you got into programming.
Oh, sure. I actually studied mathematics and then moved on to general engineering. And by the end of my degree, it kind of hit me that most of the stuff I've been really enjoying was writing the code to implement all the theoretical nicenesses.
Was that in MATLAB?
Presented with. Sorry?
Was that in MATLAB by any chance?
No, my God. I've written some OCaml mathematics stuff.
Wow, that is cool.
And my actual real production-worthy program that got used by real humans, I wrote when I was 18, and it's 150 pages of Fortran.
Oh, that is pretty awesome.
Yeah. It's something else. But then I got into actual sort of doing things for the internet. And I've been doing basic API work for the last seven-ish years. Started out as a development agency doing lots of client work. All had various kinds of APIs, from the horrendous SOAP to the really quite interested microservice architecture. And been doing it ever since.
Awesome. And I suppose there, so you kind of transitioned into, what programming languages do you currently use then? What your main's at? Probably not Fortran, I'm guessing, as a client end.
Not Fortran.
On a day-to-day basis.
My day job at the moment is a mix of Python, Ruby, and Java.
Very nice mix. And how did you get into APIs then? So I suppose while you're the way you kind of speak about your job, you are specific on APIs.
I think that's one of my main interests. And if you start doing contracts that involve web applications that are a bit big and a bit complex, then I defy you to find a place that doesn't have some kind of problem with APIs. So it doesn't need to be the most beautifully publicly documented API, but everyone
they come in all shapes and sizes.
Exactly, and everybody's dealing with their own internal contracts between their different services, and there's always, if you're doing web work, there's APIs. So, yeah.
I suppose the first question I'd like to ask about the APIs then is, where did you start off? What kind of first APIs did you really dabble with? And, the kind of, the most, I wouldn't say immature, but the most rudimentary APIs you've seen in the past?
Well, I think my first APIs were literally really old SOAP stuff with, GET, POST requests, and just trying to integrate with existing services. That's kind of when I started discovering all the different things that were out there. Is just, you have this list of services that you're trying to integrate with, and they all have their different specifications and more or less good documentation. I'm trying to make sense of all this and be what does all this stuff mean? What am I supposed to do with this? So it's gone all the way from horrendous, really old, .NET services that were very SOAP-y, to pretty good well-documented HyperMedia APIs out there.
I mean, and do you see a lot of SOAP in the wild now? Is there still a lot of it in the work you do?
So, full disclosure, most of my current clients over the last 2 years have been government clients. So there are like a lot of legacy systems that you have to integrate with, and yeah, you still see some SOAP because for a number of reasons, whether it be budget or just the service literally hasn't changed in 10 years because the requirements haven't changed, you still have to integrate with it.
I mean that makes sense, doesn't it? And for the, what actually is SOAP? Because I suppose for our audience, people probably actually may have never even used SOAP. They've probably just gone straight into, in quote, RESTful APIs. What is this thing called SOAP?
Well, SOAP is just like a way of writing XML. So it's an envelope and a markup language around XML, and you can see it a lot in sort of .NET services and some old Java services because that's how they used to write their web service domain language, and it's all like based on that envelope. So it doesn't like necessarily go against the concept of REST, if that makes sense, but it's usually a sign of it's quite an like legacy system. This is the markup that was predominant at the time, and therefore it is very rare that you see like proper resources and proper use of HTTP verbs on those APIs.
Typically just post, I'm assuming that you just get a post and they'll just do everything through that, even re-implementing things like caches
or
and
it can
things.
get even worse. Sometimes it's like all get.
Oh no.
You're actually modifying things, which goes against, what
everything
HTTP status actually is. Mind-boggling.
Oh dear. And then so moving on from that then, so you've got the SOAPs, then I suppose you get these kind of ad hoc endpoints that may return some XML or some JSON, even some YAML, whatever. I suppose where do you kind of see, because you go through these stages, like SOAP's very much, I feel, is as you say, like the corporate kind of, and it's quite nice that, it's got this idea of wizards and they can easily create skeletons within IDEs, and then you've got that kind of way. And I suppose it's then there's the self-documentation with types and things like that. And then you get into these ad hoc endpoints. And I suppose from there, when do you need, like, is there a need to move up to different ones, or like do you find that there's pain? Like the reason why you'd move from SOAP maybe to an ad hoc one, or from SOAP to a RESTful one.
So the reason why you would move to one to the other is, God, it depends.
Yep.
Let's start a counter for the number of times I say it depends on this podcast, and it's going to get really high. So why you would want to move from like an old-ish implementation to sort of a more RESTful implementation is more like who is consuming your API and what kind of, like, how many clients do you have and how, like, decoupled you wish to be. So the main reason why people want to move, like, eventually move out from the sort of like swamp of the plain old XML is they realize that, like, they want to have like a better use of their resources across the company and start having like the same kind of contracts on their different APIs. So that usually pushes the whole every single thing has ad hoc API endpoints doesn't mean anything to, let's start defining our resources and let's start using HTTP. Yeah, exactly. And then usually the sort of second step is they start focusing on their like URL structures and things like that. And it's weird because sometimes people like get attached to all those, like, let's define all our names and our URL structures properly, then spend a few years doing that, realize that they've hard-coded all over their different services, all these URLs, and that changing their contracts and changing the names of their resources, and they have versioning problems, and then it gets really painful at that point, realize that all their things are too tightly coupled, and then they start looking at Hypermedia Controls. So that they are going like the next level on their existing resources. And instead of saying, I promise that, my posts/users/Cammy/appointments is going to do this, they're going to say, I'm just going to promise that I have this operation called post an appointment to a user. And like how I implement this, I'm going to define it in such and such a way. And you don't need to hard code all these details in your client.
The hard coding has got to be, I think APIs is one of those things where anyone, you talk to any developer, they said, yeah, I've built an API. And, it's relatively easy to be able, and that's the thing, to be able to put up a simple JSON response to, a request. And then I say, yeah, that's an API. And then it's the pain of realizing how, firstly, you've got this idea of, documentation that you've got to write for the API. And, with SOAP, there is already internal documentation almost. And with REST, then, you can kind of maybe get, like some kind of intuition. Oh, if I'm going to get that resource, it's just going to give it to me. If I'm going to put to that, it'll patch it, it may replace it, and if I'm going to post it, it's going to create it and things like that. But like you say, moving up the scale, and there's something called the Richardson Maturity Model. I'm not sure. Yeah. And I was wondering, could you explain that? Like, that's to do with REST, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. So it's a 4-level like pyramid, if that's even a thing. So your level 1 is you're in this, God, what's the name? The swamp of pucks, they call it, which I find is hilarious. It's just you're in this like this plain old XML all over the place, and nothing is really properly defined in terms of resources. Your level.
And would you put that soaps defined in that level? Is that right? Or is
I would put a lot of applications that use the SOAP markup in that level, mostly because of usually it's their age. But you can use, like, you could use SOAP in a Hypermedia API. Like, that is technically possible to like do Hypermedia.
That would be pretty impressive.
but why would you? Because it doesn't support as much as all the other types of markups what you're trying to do. Anyway, so you've got your swamp of plain old XML. And then you're moving up to the next level, which are resources, which starts looking at how do you handle complexity, like divide and conquer your services, like not have one endpoint that returns everything, but starting to define your business in terms of like concepts and resources, like your users and your appointments and your whatever the hell you're building. So at that point, some people like map it really well to their domain. So you start having things that are the correct names for the business, and they start making sense to people. And then on top of that, once you have defined your resources, the next level is using HTTP verbs. So it's sticking as close as possible to the HTTP like standard set of like get, post, put, delete, and handles similar situations that would happen to a specific resource in the same kind of way. So if you have a user, you can, get it, post on it to add information, or delete it. And once you're done with all that, then there's the glory of REST, which comes at the highest level, which is Hypermedia Controls.
So doing level 0 to 2, or 0, like 1, 2, 3, and 4, 1, 2, and 3, POCs and then resources, and you're not at REST then? Is that not, because I think at the time of perceptions, everyone thinks I'm now RESTful. I've now using the verbs, and I've got these amazing resources that have got these lovely names that I'm so attached to, and things like that.
So if you take REST as this is what is defined by Roy Thomas Fielding paper and the Fielding dissertation, then no, you're technically not doing REST. If your API doesn't have some kind of discoverability and some kind of way of making your, like, whatever protocol you have a bit more self-documenting. That's a very hand-wavy way of saying it. So, yeah.
And that actually moves on to saying, like, because REST, standing for Representational State Transfer, which is quite a mouthful, is from Royal Thomas Fielding, and
yes.
It's early. It was 2000, I think, his paper was released. Yeah, and I suppose that was in the heyday of SOAP and things like that. And I mean, SOAP has its own way of being able to discover things with WSDLs. So how are you able to discover RESTful services? Does that come in level 3, the Hypermedia?
Well, yes. Like, discoverability really happens only when you have Hypermedia Controls. Otherwise, you're still hard coding whatever your URIs are, and you need to know what those URIs are and their contract to be able to do anything. Whereas Hypermedia gives you like the next level of, I have a resource, what can I do with it now? Type of concerns.
So it doesn't mean documentation, like external documentation. It means it's kind of in the story, the flow of that resource at that time. Yeah,
so I wouldn't consider, if you imagine the perfect like Hypermedia API existing out there, I wouldn't consider just that API to be sufficient documentation for someone just to be able to pick up and use it. I know that's like somewhat of a controversial statement, but literally no one is going to look at every single one of your endpoints to figure out what your API does, right? You still need to say, this is vaguely the resources that I have, and this is the kind of operations that you can do, and this is my contract to you, developers and people who integrate with me. Like these are the operations I have don't you mind about what addresses they're at, but those are the operations. And like, this is the message format that I use. Doesn't matter about how you serialize your whatever JSON, but this is the message format. And by the way, this is how you transition from one stage to the next.
And I think that is the thing then with Hypermedia, and adding that on is this idea of state transformations. Yeah. And along with Hypermedia, there's this horrible acronym called HATEOAS. I'm just wondering, would you mind to explain to the audience what exactly is HATEOAS?
Hypertext as the engine of application state, which is completely unhelpful to just explain the acronym. It is actually just that. It is using hypertext to basically tell your users and your clients where they are in your API process flow and what your transitions are.
Awesome. And what is the advantage then? So, I mean, you could, in another sense, be able to say, okay, I've got a REST API, not in the raw fielding sense because I'm not using level 3, but I've got some good documentation and people can use it that way. The transition to Hypermedia, what advantages does it have over having like a bunch of externally documented APIs?
Right.
Or
so
endpoints,
it depends.
Yeah, it depends.
So a lot of APIs, you're sort of mapping some kind of process, right? Your user is trying to accomplish something. The usual, like, boring example is booking an appointment. But I think about most APIs these days, you're not just trying to read one piece of data. You're just like actually interacting with it in a sensible process type way. So what you don't want to do, for example, in the book an appointment example, is tell all of your clients, okay, so first you need to get the person you're trying to book an appointment, and this is the hard-coded URL that you will use. And then once you have that person, you will look at that field, which is their user ID, and then you will look at their availability. So that's this other API endpoint. And then given their availability and yours, and you can post to this third API endpoint and figure out what's going on. So here you've already got 3 hard-coded things. So, well, if you have a contract, you can't change them, right? Because you don't want all of your clients to fail over, because the last thing you want to do is be blocked to change all these things because you're basically bound to your slowest client to adapt. So not only is it painful for you, but it's also a pain for your clients. So what you can do here is say, all right, so there is an operation where you can book an appointment with a person, and this is the name of your operation. And then our contract with you is that every time you click next or some kind of dynamic name that you give to your process, it will take you to the next step that you need to accomplish to do that. So if your business process changes and suddenly you need to do an extra step in terms of getting a confirmation of the user's phone number before you book an appointment, I don't even know. That is in your dynamic process flows, and your clients won't break horribly, and it's easier for you because you can still change a few things about your API and not break the contract you have with your client.
That's it, yeah, rightfully so. It is the contract that you don't want to break. And, if you have these, because I think one thing with Hypermedia that first got with me was the whole idea of, if you're generating URLs, it's a sin. You should not be manually creating these URLs. You should always be returned what you can do next, and it should be the responsibility of the server to give that to you. So as to then the responsibility for changing it and updating it remains with the server, as opposed to, as you say, the least the client that's the last to change. You don't have to worry about that anymore.
That's right, and you can still provide a list of, hey, this is all the endpoints. This is literally everything my API does. But my real contract with you is not to never change those URLs. My contract with you is to always provide these operations in always the same type of message format. And that's your promise. Yeah, and it's much easier promise to fulfill than never changing any hard-coded URL ever.
And that's it. And as you say, it changes. The story may change as well. The way you've been explaining, this idea of a story that's going through, and having this idea, maybe you want to add something into the process. Having this idea that allowing the server again to have responsibility for this, you're able then to add extra kind of parts to the story. And I think that was really cleverly done in your video that was recorded, was to do with the little prince. I thought that was really interesting, adding in, and then you were saying, like, within the story, so you had this, obviously, A, B, C, the story chapter book, but then you wanted the only story of the prince and things like that. I thought it was a really well put.
Right. I think I was trying to find an example where essentially you have this concept of resources and things, and the way you want to navigate them is going to change, but you never want to break the whole, I want to be able to read my book and go from page to page and be fine with that. But like as a user, I just want to be like, give me page 1, and then next is page 2, and next is page 3. But then I might want to skip into additional context and still want to be able to go back to these things without knowing that I need to go to /book/ unique ID of the book /pages/2. That's
not nice. and I mean that, because I think that was a common misconception with me, actually, with my kind of idea of hypermedia. Was then, it was like thinking, I can remove my documentation now. It's like this idea of self-documenting code. It's a self-documented API, but you say it's really the abstractions are there because you want to be able to, again, the responsibility to the server to be able to say, this is what you can do next, or this is what you can do at this time, so I can change this, as opposed to, no, this is not like the documentation that you can read. Right.
So that's the problem with when you say discoverability. It's not like, here's root of my API, go have fun.
Yeah, don't load up Postman now and just go and play with it, and you're going to understand it completely at this time.
Exactly, because there is still documentation about, okay, so these are all my operations. Here is in human terms what they do, and here is how you're going to evolve from one operation to another, and here's the keywords that I use, and those keywords are never going to change. Like, you put them in the rel or whatever it is that you use in your markup to do that. But like, that's the stuff that doesn't change. Your URLs change, the shape of your resources may change a bit, but not that. And it doesn't replace documentation in any way.
Yeah, and with Hypermedia, so there's one endpoint that's fixed, almost, and that is the start, the root. You go to there, and then you're able to start the story. Am I right in thinking that you need to know where to start, at least? I suppose
yeah, it depends, but yes, like eventually, if you're saying I have an API that does something, you will still be somewhere on the internet. So whatever you do, you're kind of bound to saying I'm available at api.blah.blah, right? Then what you do with that and what level of granularity you can have with that with different journeys, and whether you actually want everything at the root or whether you want actually several like root URLs.
Kind of split them out.
Yeah, it really depends. That really depends on your domain and what your users are trying to do with it. And you can still provide like access to all of your URLs and list them if people really want to go there. But you're not promising that you're not going to change them. You're promising that all these journeys are not going to break.
That's it. And that's what I was going to ask, actually, is kind of your opinion and kind of and I say, I'm pretty sure I know what the answer is going to be, but, with,
it's always, it depends.
It's really, see this idea, start going through these stories, really quite nice, because especially when designing these APIs, I find it far more gratifying and actually playing a story out, as opposed to just thinking in resources and, really, telling the story in the design of the API, as opposed to just saying, here's a lump of data. Did you feel that Hypermedia is really a replacement for everything, or do you feel there is still requirements for just these endpoints that just have a load of data and that you can do whatever you want with?
It depends.
I knew it.
I think it really depends on what kind of service you're building. And the reason I'm saying that is some services. So let's assume, for example, you're publishing a massive API that is literally something for users to look at. I work in government, so the first obvious example I can think of is, here's loads of stats about what we're doing at the moment, and it's like transparency data. There is no specific journey through it. It's more like you have a citizen come in and it's like, I'm interested in this particular subject on this date. What stats do you have?
That's it, yeah.
And this is where a Hypermedia API, what are you actually going to get out of it? I'm not quite sure. What you can do though is say, I will, however, promise to have like /transparency data / let's say labor market, and under there I will list all my resources. And like I do promise that root URL is not going to go away, and all those resources are going to stay there. But this is something different, right? You're looking at different types of things. Some of these this is data that is supposed to live not quite forever, but basically forever for reasons of transparency and things like that. And some other APIs are not about forever readable data, it's sort of encyclopedia of the internet type APIs, but rather my user is trying to do this operation with me and I'm going to get them through the process.
That's it. At this time, that's what they need to do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And some domains never change. And some domains change all the time. So your business operations are going to change all the time. But the fact that, for example, you have a list of postcodes in the UK, or you have a list of police stations mapped to postcodes, you don't necessarily need a HyperMedia API for that. You just need, /police station /postcode. It gives you your police stations. I don't know.
No, absolutely. And as you say, it does depend. And it's the design, because an API is very much tied to the business needs and the business requirements and the business domain you're in. And, adding this kind of hypermedia stuff on top only plays, a good part, only adds, value to the actual, finished product if you do have these stories.
So, and I also argue that, hypermedia is sort of seen, because you see the public API documentation, I'm a much bigger advocate of them also internally, as in, if you have lots of multidisciplinary teams doing lots of different things in different parts of your service, you're all in charge of your, part of the product that does something vaguely specific, and your team is in charge of the intricacies of that process. And so what you want, instead of, if your process changes a bit, you don't want to bother 7 of the other teams to change their code. What you want to do is provide something consistent for your code to be decoupled from the rest of your product. So a lot of people are like, "Ooh, hypermedia on the outside," but to me, there's an even bigger win trying to experiment with it within as internal APIs, because it gives you all this good decoupling. And by that I mean, sorry, I'm ranting a bit here.
No, that's fine.
But if you're sort of starting to work with basically more than 5 developers, and you start having a multiple number of teams working on the same product, eventually what happens is you want to have your little domains of expertise within your product, and the best way is having a good internal contract and not having to duplicate the work all the time between the teams. So the way I've seen HyperMedia APIs work really well is facilitating your multidisciplinary team to just go along and work on the product and refine the business process and change the code as a team without breaking up everyone else's stuff. And in that way, your thing is still vaguely deployable quite independently from the other services, and you're just shipping things quicker that way. And there is a lot of talk about that inside big companies and bigger services, simply because we're looking at either I know that microservices is the buzzword at the moment, but a lot of people are trying to see how they can, be able to do continuous integration, continuous deployment, and deploy them multiple parts of the service independently, and having these contracts that, are HyperMedia APIs instead of hard-coded things is a way to facilitate that.
Absolutely. And with that then, because you've got Hypermedia APIs, then it's obviously the technologies that have been implemented to help facilitate that. Right. And there's a lot of them. And there's no agreed upon standard, if I'm right in thinking, at this time. It's really, there's a couple that you can choose from, a couple of big players. I'm just wondering if you could maybe go through some and kind of what experience you've had with them.
Right. So this is we're diving in right into the cons of HyperMedia APIs, because my God, there's a lot of stuff out there.
It's because it's become a buzzword in itself, hasn't it? As you say, microservices has. Hypermedia is very much that as well, where people say it, but then they probably don't do it, or they probably just think of it as the tooling around it, as opposed to the philosophy of it being these stories, and the idea is to break up this responsibility.
I kind of feel like most of the technical buzzwords, though, that's the case, right? There isn't million definitions of agile and microservice and hypermedia, and everybody's got their own flavor going on, and it's all a bit difficult to make sense of it. But so internally, like the choices that you have to make when you decide to go hypermedia, it kind of depends what you have already in place and where you're going. So the big players in terms of actually formatting, how would I say that? So the big sort of formats that people are playing with, there is JSON-LD, there's HAL, Collection+JSON, and SIREN, and there's even like Uber, and there's JSON API.
And it goes on and on and on.
There's all these buzzwords kicking around. But essentially, you're making three choices when you're actually choosing technology. And I don't believe they need to be essentially the same one for the entire company or the entire product. So the first choice you're kind of making is, how am I going to describe my data in my service? So you're looking at sort of JSON API type definitions or JSON schema. And the next part you're going to do is, how am I defining sort of the hypermedia structure of my API? And there you can look at JSON-LD and HAL, Collection+JSON, SIREN. And then finally, you have to make the choice of, if I am to implement, let's say, prototypes and trying to design those APIs, what kind of markup language can I use to communicate these possible changes to the API that I want to make, so that everyone can have a look at it? So that's the RAML API blueprint swaggers of this world. So back to where I started. So if you look at JSON-LD, for example, my experience of it, it's been really great once you have an existing, and I'm going to put RESTful between massive air quotes, though you can't see that because this is a podcast. It's great for augmenting existing RESTful between air quotes APIs without introducing breaking changes. So it's kind of a good way to go from, all right, I have my resources and they're returned as JSON, and now I can self-document my API through this specification. And if I want to add actions onto that without breaking my existing contracts, I can also look into Hydra as part of that, where I can define my actions as part of that. And there's all kinds of schemas around that. JSON-LD is great for transitioning, but it is not the most lightweight thing you can do. So I've used it successfully on small JSON APIs that had tons and tons of resources, where we wanted to augment just a few of the endpoints.
Right.
With a bit of documentation and a bit of like, this is my next action, but without wanting to overhaul the entire product. So this wouldn't, as you say, wouldn't do any breaking changes. It would just enhance. Exactly. So the couple of ones I really enjoyed doing was, so we have this business process that it was breaking all the time because there are lots of legal changes or policy changes around how you do this operation. And this is where we added a tiny bit of JSON-LD and Hydra, so that we changed the code that had all these URLs hard-coded, and we're just looking at those Hydra things. So the entire API isn't proper hypermedia. Like, you can't navigate it as a whole. It doesn't document itself. But the couple of business processes that were particularly volatile are now with a next action.
That's not the variables there. You've been able to inject a variable into the areas that you need to be able to switch them there. Way.
So yes, this isn't the most consistent design across the endpoints. Yes, this isn't proper hypermedia because my entire API is not discoverable, but has it delivered one of the values that is important to one of my clients, which is, let's not break our contract all the time and have something that we can change as the policy and as the legal stuff changes? Then yeah, it did do the work. So I would recommend that I have an existing thing and I kind of don't want to overhaul the entire thing because it would cost me way too much time and money, but I want to transition slowly to doing that.
Would the transition, would it eventually need a full rewrite, or would this be able to be a small transition? Would you slowly be able to bring up JSON-LD to the point of the next step, or? So
I've had two examples. One of them was, it was so massive that there was no way in hell we would have the resource to do it. And that sort of solved the problem. And there were a lot of very highly used endpoints and a few endpoints that we unfortunately couldn't get rid of because we had promised those URLs. This is why you don't do it in the first place. And the second one was really interesting because the lawyers and the policy people who were looking at the process thought this was really good and we should do the same things with the other endpoints. And then suddenly we JSON-LD'd the entire thing, and that was awesome. But it was driven from we could map out those business processes, and then every time that law changes, then we can just go talk to our business owners and go talk to our developers, and they will make the correct changes, but all of the other services aren't going to break horribly. So it gives you a bit of flexibility there. That was much appreciated by the lawyers.
I can imagine that, yeah.
So, augmenting existing APIs, my experience JSON-LD, quite good. If you're doing it from scratch and you're trying to convince people who are a bit new to the world of hypermedia, I found HAL to be particularly useful, especially if you live in XML world, because HAL has a bit more maturity when it comes to, it's more of an XML thing as far as I've seen. Now, I could be wrong. Maybe there's some beautiful JSON HAL thing existing out there. But it's quite lightweight. That's a good part of it. It's not too much complexity in your code. It's really quite easy to implement. So that's...
Yeah, we found HAL to be very much a nice start, to kind of this way of thinking, where it's a very much simple, here are your links, here are your embeds, and here's your data. And that's it. You can really kind of keep the concepts you already know, and you just know that these are the places where they're meant to stay.
Exactly. So it's quite lightweight. It's quite easy to implement. It's easy to convince people that it's probably not a horrible idea. But again, there is a lack of support for specifying some actions, right? So a bit like you have to use Hydra if you're doing JSON-LD stuff to specify actions. Like this is where HAL falls short, because in order to specify your actions, there's not really anything shipped in as part of it. But,
Yeah, it would just be the endpoint, wouldn't it? It would be a link, and then this is, and you wouldn't know whether to put to that to post. Whatever you do, you don't know exactly.
Right. But then it depends what your business domain is, and you might not need to go into like a lot of different actions. So fair enough. But sometimes you do need that. So if you do need like a full-fledged, quite powerful, and you don't really need to augment like bit by bit your existing API, then I would turn to the sort of SIREN, Collection+JSON of this world. I haven't played with Uber. I've heard good things, but that's why I'm not going to talk about it. It's just I don't know. But yeah, SIREN to me is really quite hard to implement because there's not that much stuff out there yet. And you need to have developers who are into reading white papers and understanding what it is.
So are there many implementations for languages, or is it very much you have to write your own?
So there is some stuff in Java that I know of, but I haven't seen that many very well supported implementations out there. Again, could be horribly wrong because things do change.
They change overnight.
So please prove me wrong. But it's really good if you're trying to do like generic stuff at large scale, and it does it doesn't have a problem of HAL where you have to have all your actions in there. So.
All right, because guess what? Yeah, so what are the differences then with that compared to HAL? What does it offer?
So SIREN introduces the concept of like classes to your different models. So it gives some kind of type information to your API responses, and this is probably why I've been doing it. In retrospect, it's because I've been working with lots of Java developers, and that's why it appeals. So don't listen to me. Maybe I'm just extremely biased. But yeah, I've done SIREN XML Java stuff. It works well if you have lots of generic concepts and you need to like put your types in there. And then finally, Collection+JSON is really unfortunately named because it's actually really good at single stuff, not just collections.
I think that's one thing. When I started looking at it, you essentially collection, and you're like, no, why name it this? Why tie it to, as you say, a bad naming for it?
Yeah. So I quite like it because it does it gives you like collection supports and different templates that people can use to edit your stuff.
Yeah.
So the only successful thing that I've done in Collection.json, the other stuff, it just seemed like overkill for what I was doing. It's been basically think like a wiki type implementation. So you've got a bunch of data that lots of people are editing at the same time. And they're all editing it in different ways. So you've got a bunch of like users editing the same data, and that works quite well because you can define all your templates that people can use to alter your stuff and your list of stuff. So that's quite nice. So we were doing like crowdsourcing of locations and crowdsourcing of different resources across government, and that worked quite well.
So at this time then, did you pick the right kind of library or quite like standard for that project at that time, as opposed to having one that you feel works well with the majority?
I would still like just choose whatever works well with my project and what I'm trying to do. And it is kind of disconcerting that there are that many sort of different protocols, and it's kind of hard to keep in touch with everything.
Is there kind of becoming like, are they all kind of crossroads a little bit where they're going to start, you know, maybe becoming a one standard, but or do you reckon that would never be the case, that you all have, you know, these distinct paths to choose and they're just mature at their own rate?
Right, so I would hope that eventually like a couple of them would win, but as I see it at the moment with a lot of the sort of blogs and talks and stuff that is going around, there doesn't seem to be one that is chosen. And I'm not that sad about it. So on some side there is none of these standards fit what I'm doing. I'm just going to define a new, do a new. I'm going to
do my own thing.
Boom! You have a new standard
with a cool name, and there you go, and a GitHub repository, and it's out there.
Exactly. It's just there's a classic XKCD cartoon about that. It's great. On the other side, I'm not actually that fussed because I just want to. I don't actually care about saying my entire company will use HAL. Because all I care about is I promise that there will be these operations, and that's going to be their message format. That's it.
That's it. That absolutely, and that is then the Hypermedia way. That it gives you that flexibility of choosing what you need.
Yeah.
On the top level, highest level, it is doing the same thing and doing this for you.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because you have RESTful, which was the dissertation was written by someone who was like probably the expert in HTTP and what it even means, but those things are changing too, and you have like HTTP 2 coming, and people are whispering about HTTP 3 and what that kind of means in terms of how web services are going to communicate with each other, and that might change or might not change how we want to model things. But again, my interest, I have to admit, is more about how are these teams going to ship these different things independently without hard coding all the things and having all these nice decoupled services so that my users can have a consistent experience that doesn't break and where I can ship different things in my different teams quickly, because that's all I care about. I should get excited about all these standards, but eventually maybe one will win and I'll be glad to see which one it is, but all these things have pros and cons, and you just kind of juggled. But
no, absolutely. And then talking about...
I'm sure other people will be more opinionated than me.
No, I think it's the best way of being, really, is, it's, again, it's almost like you can kind of transition to programming languages. People are very passionate about a programming language, but it's the problem it's trying to solve. It's a tool in your belt that you're using, as opposed to I'm only going to use how. That's all I'm going to use. It's the ideology of, okay, it's solving a problem. That's it. It's solving this problem of, as you say, I want, this kind of these variables here. I'm able to, have these easy transitions without everything breaking due to hard coded, URLs, etc. Yeah.
So I don't know. I do like conforming to standards. So if there's a good open standard, I by all means stick to it. HTML, Atom, they're a thing. Don't try to reinvent them, please. But when it comes to all these things that aren't yet proper standards, all I care about is, we're just going to stick to a message format. Don't implement a corporate rule that sort of has crazy rules about how you should write URIs and crazy rules about what resources should be named what. I
was wondering about that, because now with Hypermedia and this idea that you're, essentially passing the URLs to the client now, the idea of a pretty URI doesn't really matter anymore. People spent so much time on crafting these perfect URIs. the URI isn't really anything important anymore because of the fact that it's the actions that you're going to be getting back. It could be any URI.
You know what? You're absolutely right. I think I had this. I think it was a few months ago. I was in this we're trying to design an API together, and I think a couple of people were arguing about what the URL should be, and I was like, "Don't get."
Yeah, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter because, I mean, what would happen is you'd kind of baggage on the fact that, but the URI's got to make sense because it's this kind of intent of the action that's going to happen. And it's like, well, no, we've got this perfectly good thing here now that clearly expresses that, as opposed to baggage it onto the fact that the URI needs to, because people. So no, it is a much better way.
I will actually argue that I just want my operation name to be in plain English, with words that people can understand, and that operation name is documented somewhere.
That's it. And and you shouldn't care about the URI because you're doing it wrong if you do, because that could change and you don't want that.
It depends.
It depends. And it does depend. That should be a caveat on everything, yeah. And moving on from that, the third thing you mentioned was the API design tools and tooling around it. Because you've got the idea of JSON-LD, and you've got the ideas of the Collection+JSONs, etc. like that. And designing these APIs has really become more of I would say, not an art, that sounds a bit, but the kind of a lot more work has gone into them, because you start caring about the fact, I've been able to, I suppose maybe my naivety of the APIs I've once, done, where it was essentially in the SOAP world, you just create this, and it would just do a wizard and it would generate these skeletons for you, and that's your API, as opposed to then, it's just dump a load of JSON out. Now it's kind of thinking of stories and actually API driven development, essentially, where you're designing these APIs up front using tools such as RAML. I'm just wondering, has that, I know that you've been working a lot in the API space, and do you really think, I suppose you do actually think about the API first? That is really the port of call, where, get a good solid API down first, and then you're able to work from there. I
would actually argue that's the second thing we do. So the first thing is what even are we trying to do?
That is a good argument. I'll take that.
I have fallen guilty. I can admit publicly that I have fallen guilty to the whole we have all these resources and there is all the cool things we can do with.
Exactly. Taking that skip. Yep, that's it. Take a skip. Yeah, skipping the step of what we're solving. Yeah. Do I even need an API in the first place? Is the first thing you should think of.
Yeah, this is why it's so great to work on teams where it's not just, developers, and you actually have lots of business people and
that is it. Yeah. Because eventually it's someone may think, I'm going to be able to craft this thing. It's actually, no, you just need a pencil. That will solve this problem. Here's the problem. Oh, you don't even need a computer program. Here's a pencil. That will solve it. It's horrible for us, obviously, as developers. But we've got to use this cool thing, and you really do just skip. I mean, a lot of our solutions obviously do need programming and do need these skills, but some of them don't. And it is, as you say, it's hard. Like me, I just skipping to the fact, we need to build an API.
So yeah. I think, it depends. Well, I do say that a lot. So the way that I've seen API designed, literally on whiteboard and sort of writing down your URIs and looking at all your resources and stuff. And I found that sort of moderately useful if I have no idea what the domain actually is and what data is available there. But in the real world, I hardly find that useful. So usually it's about okay, so what are we trying to do? We're trying to, do this operation that will need a number of things across a service. And then you start identifying so for this I will need authentication, and for this I will need my user, and I will need my booking service, and I will need all those other services. And at that point you start looking at what operations you already have defined on those services, and whether it's just you're going to use those, or whether those operations need to be tweaked in a way to support your new thing. So it usually ends up more in boxes of what is the different steps of your business process and where is it going to go between all your different services before you can do something, give something useful back to your client. And there is a bit of what is your client API looking like, and how are we going to document that new process? But to me, most of the work is more who am I supposed to talk to in this world? In what order am I going to do things? How do I
story flow?
That none of these things break the other services? How do I make sure that this is vaguely performant and I do get back to my user eventually? that's
talking about performance. Actually, is a good thing. Like, have you found that kind of adding on this level of hypermedia, has that been more performant or less performant? Have you found that or just the same as, kind of these big dumps of data, etc.?
It
depends. I'm going to say it probably depends.
No, I don't think the use of hypermedia or non-hypermedia affects the performance of your application per se, because you can go from one step to another using rels, or you could just hard code URLs and it's still the same code running behind. But in terms of helping your developers think about how they do their services and their internal APIs, that can have interesting consequences. And it is hard work.
Because I was thinking the splitting up of stories and, the amount of requests then you may do if you're going next to next to next, as opposed to just giving them everything and things like that.
Yeah, it is absolutely hard work. But then it's about doing that thinking of what the different steps are in your process. Yeah. And that's where you need to work with business people who understand what the domain is. And then you need to know what your different service promises are. But it is actually easier in a way to do that in a world where you just have loads of services with a few operations on all of them, because then you just have your tool belt of here's all my operations. I don't actually care how they're implemented, but here's my operations, and here's how I can deploy them in this order vaguely to make these things happen.
So what experience have you had with like the description languages like RAML and Swagger and API? Because it's a Blueprint. I mean, this is another area that has kind of a few to choose from. Yeah,
so I've never used RAML. I've heard good things, but I've never used it, so I won't give any reckons about it. I've used API Blueprint and Swagger. The main difference I found is just like Markdown versus JSON, but both were open source, and both you could generate your documentation from your code, and that was fairly useful. I think Swagger I've struggled with recently when I've moved from here's a bunch of resources with operations and started doing a bit more like, and here's my next action and things, because Swagger doesn't really support that. So that's where it fell short for me, and kind of same with API Blueprint, even though they do have a bit of support. I have no particular opinion about which one you should use beyond what is like the thing that your people who are going to design the API understand well. And if it's Markdown, then great. And if it's JSON, then great. And if it's YAML, then great.
That's it. Yeah, there's not exactly. No, I mean that's true. I mean they are very similar tools, aren't they? And each have maybe a couple of pros and cons of each. But yeah, as a sort of a kind of generic thing, they're solving the same problem. Yeah. I mean, suppose getting to a codified prototype solution of things like do you generate? Would you go and use these description languages and tooling to generate a mock in quotes API that you then use, or do you prefer to build up the API in the language you're going to be using it?
It really depends how quickly you need to build things and how sure you are. Like if we have time to sort of build mini prototypes, then great, we'll just bash out a really quick API and see what happens. But if it involves like lots of people and I need to communicate my point clearly, then I'd rather have a bit of documentation and we can all look at it together and decide what's best to do. I think the interesting parts in these is they are tools that enable you to have that process of thinking what you want to do.
Yeah. They aid discussion and things
rather
like that.
Than this is the be-all and end-all, and if you don't use Swagger, your service will dissolve. I don't know. That's not a thing.
No, I mean, absolutely, yeah. It aids, as you say, the discussion. It sparks the discussion points that could have been happened in maybe a prototype, but maybe happened a bit quicker because you were thinking of that, process in an earlier time. And like, because as you're saying, like at the moment you're working with Python, Ruby and Java, I'm just wondering, just kind of a more high level there, what kind of you feel what languages have the most, what kind of is the feeling within each language? Because I kind of feel maybe Java's more prone, as you say, to the corporate SOAP based ones, whereas Ruby very REST. I mean, Rails have its own concept of REST and ability to do REST APIs out of the box, I think.
It has resources and implements sort of the get, post, put, delete stuff on resources out of the box. It doesn't do REST out of the box without a bit of thinking. It is possible, but I think it's possible in every language. At the moment, it so happens that like the bulk sort of corporate stuff, is written in Java, but then, and we do a lot of sort of sketching and prototyping stuff in Ruby and Python when we need like super small services that we want to play about in. I feel like all these Java is corporate and, Ruby is blah, blah, blah. That kind of comes from history and it comes
it is true. I mean, I am a bit tongue-in-cheek there when I say that, because, I mean, Java has grown well in the last couple of years, and I think it's a tool, so it's how you're using it. So, obviously people may pen Java as being, this kind of boring old moving machine, but it's because you're having to use it in that sense. Maybe Ruby, if you started using Ruby in a corporate setting, where you have a spec and you can't change it because, there's value in that still, that way that program was running 5 years ago. I think it would be the same.
It's just one of these things where it depends. There is no correct answer. It's all about like who is actually, to hand, and what your existing services are and what you're building, whether you actually care about OO or if you want to do something that lends itself more to functional, or whether you're, what kind of developer tooling you want to have.
And that's the beauty of your HTTP, is that, it neutralizes that, uniforms all the barriers, so as, to allow us to use these standards that are, doesn't matter what the client's using or what the server's using, they're all going to be able to, use these same things.
I think eventually it's all about, I want to achieve a good decoupled architecture, and I want to promise to the consumers of my API that all the changes to my service will be non-breaking. And the way I will honor that promise and I honor that contract is by implementing those different things you can do with Hypermedia that enable you to work like that, instead of having to deal with versioning and having to deal with breaking URLs and all that horribleness.
So another thing with Hypermedia, and that is obviously versioning, because as you say, you don't want to break URLs. So what you do is you say, okay, we're going to have to support version 1, we'll bump it up and have version 2, and it's brand new and it's got all these new URLs and etc. and it's got this new documentation. So Hypermedia is, due to the fact that it's got this idea of, this variable input, variables where you're able to essentially, tweak where these things are going on, etc. Does that lend itself then not to have versioning, and you just kind of progressively change as and when you need?
Basically, it depends, but yes.
Yep, that is the aim. That is the
100% sweeping. It is impossible to have versioning. Sometimes your business changes so much that you can't even support an operation that you used to support. So obviously, you're going to break your contract there. But if it's the same operation that you're doing and there's only minor tweaks, when I start looking at definitions of APIs and it's like /v9, it's like, oof.
Oh no.
Because that implies a breaking change, right?
That's it. I wouldn't want to be on that chain.
I don't care if you're pushing new stuff to your API every day. That's awesome. I just don't want to have to change my client every 3 months because of, changes that you make up.
That's it. And then add probably no value to the fact that bit of work's been out there for a year working as it was and as it should. I don't need to change these, absolutely.
And of course, sometimes, legal frameworks change and business change and businesses go down, and you do have like major problems, and these things do change. But eventually, if you're having to version things for, let's say, business as usual changes, you have bigger problems than defining your URLs. You definitely have bigger problems in how you're writing and architecting your applications.
And finally, again, thank you so much for taking the time to come on. It's been really interesting discussing all these points. And I'm just wondering, is there any other resources that you find valuable, or tools or applications or places for people to kind of follow on Twitter, etc.? Follow yourself as obviously, as well. But anyone else, you kind of, looked up to in this space?
Oh, sure. Actually, well, my two blogs that I really read and love in that space and in the space of software architecture in general, it's Martin Fowler and it's Mike Munson. Mike specializes in APIs and he's got some amazing talks out there, and he should be on this podcast because he would explain this so much better than I possibly can. But he sort of gets it right, and it's all about decoupling, and it's about software architecture instead of the nitty-gritty protocol idiocies. And Martin Fowler's blog, I think, is just such a great resource.
It is amazing, isn't it?
Because it's not just specifically about APIs, it's about what is this microservice thing, what's going on, and explains it step by step in good, user-friendly words. And yeah, if there was something that you need to read, then I would go with that.
Thank you. So yeah, no, that I completely agree. And so, sorry, one last thing. I just thought a question came into my mind there, was just the microservices. Like, as you said, that is a buzzword now, and Hypermedia, I suppose, is very much helping the concept of microservices, as you know, these, because obviously, you know, you want these things not to break when you change them, and microservices are the idea of changing. Have you had like a lot of experience with microservices and Hypermedia?
So what I'm doing at the moment is, well, there's quite a few microservices, and there is, as most people have, there is this big API that we're trying to sort of break into pieces. So that's all the fun. I've had mixed experiences with microservices from let's take a bunch of software developers and let's make them do, you know, experiment with things, and it kind of all gets into a bit of yak shave. And I've had good experiences with microservices where like they are built around like areas of your business, and you have like good multidisciplinary teams working all these different services, and that works better. So I can't see any significant difference in the technical approach and how we deployed things and how we did things, but I can see major differences, and the success was the humans working on these different services weren't like siloed in their different specialities. They were, you know, they were regrouped around areas of the business and areas of the product. And suddenly the same types of technical choices that you have available become the correct ones, because you're deploying them in a good way, because you're interacting with the humans that you work with in a good way. Because that's all what it comes to, right? You can talk about all the protocols, but eventually the hard stuff is, how do you carve up your teams well? How do you get all these right disciplines of the right teams? And how do you get all these people doing work semi-independently that all contributes to the core product?
Brilliant. I think absolutely. I completely agree. And again, thank you so much, Camille, for coming on the podcast. It's been really interesting talking to you.
Thank you for having me.
And sorry for, you know, a deja vu moment, it's almost like we had to have two introductions. You never would guess on this recorded episode now. But yeah, that's for the ether. All right then, audience. Well, it's been another great episode of 3 Devs and a Maybe. And yeah, I'll speak to you next week. Goodbye.
You've been listening to 3 Devs and a Maybe. You can contact us at contact@3devsandamaybe.com or follow us on Twitter at 3 Devs and a Maybe.